Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Merit Jano, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the George W. Ball Lecture. This lecture is one of our most important annual events at SIPA. The Ball Lecture and the visiting professor that comes with the Ball Lecture was established in 2009. And we have had remarkable people join us. It is really a wonderful opportunity for us to bring in leaders in the spirit of George Ball. As many of you know, George Ball served as Undersecretary of State in the Kennedy and Johnson administration. He's perhaps best known for his opposition to the escalation of the United States involvement in Vietnam, something he spoke out about publicly and thus earned a reputation as someone willing to challenge conventional orthodoxy, although he himself was quite an establishment figure. The Ball Professor is typically a senior leader or an individual who's had very senior policy experience and is also very direct and frank in his or her views. We've had some remarkable colleagues join us, including recently His Excellency Tomas Ilves, former president of Estonia, Juan Gabriel Valdez, former Chilean ambassador to the United States and foreign minister, Nirupama Rao, former foreign secretary of India and ambassador to the United States, Kishore Mahbubani, longtime diplomat from Singapore, and others. And we're delighted to have with us this spring as our Ball Professor, Ambassador Chris Hill, who is with us in New York and in fact teaching in a hybrid instruction at SIPA in New York. Ambassador Hill, thank you so much for being with us this very challenging spring, but nevertheless teaching a remarkable course. Now, Ambassador Hill served for 33 years in the U.S. Foreign Service and was at the forefront of U.S. foreign policy in key regions in the world. His service included positions as U.S. Ambassador in Iraq, in the Republic of Korea, Poland, and Macedonia, each obviously presenting unique challenges. He also served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. He was involved in efforts to end North Korea's nuclear weapons program, which induced North Korea to catalog its nuclear activities and freeze and disable its plutonium production in 2008 and 2009. He served as U.S. envoy in negotiations that ended the Kosovo War in 1999, and he was a lead negotiator that helped forge the agreement that ended the Bosnian War in 1995. Following his retirement from the State Department, he served as Dean of the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver from 2010 to 2017, and then head of the university's Global Engagement and Professor of Practice and Diplomacy. He's the author of a memoir, Outpost, A Diplomat at Work, which I think I see right behind him, which is very nice, which Kirkus reviews called a must for anyone contemplating a foreign service career and for general readers looking for insight into diplomacy conducted at the highest levels. And at SIPA this spring, Ambassador Hill is teaching a course on issues in post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy. We're delighted to have him with us today to give his lecture entitled The Future of Diplomacy in Uncertain Times. What a topic of importance. And following his remarks, we're grateful to be joined by Professor Steven Sestanovich, who is the Catherine Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of International Diplomacy at SIPA and also leads our International Fellows Program. He himself is a former ambassador, having served as Ambassador at Large and Special Advisor to the Secretary of State on new independent states following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he's held many other significant positions within the State Department, National Security Council, leading think tanks. Thank you very much for joining us. Ambassador Hill, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dean. And let me say what a fabulous job you have done at this just wonderful institution of SIPA. I mean, these are tough times. We were talking about some of the challenges of, running a school during a pandemic and being whether faculty or student, and it's certainly been a time that will be remembered, to be sure. I will say though, what a pleasure it's been having the honor really of teaching some of your students. I mean, they are really they are destined for future positions of leadership, and it's a great honor to be in front of them and to see them all have all the reading done, usually by Friday, and they ask for more of it by Monday. They're impressive. So this institution is just second to none, and it's a great honor to be here. And for me as well, it's a particularly great honor to be here in the name of, to give a lecture really in the name of George W. Ball. George W. Ball is no stranger to those of us who've come from the Foreign Service, and I count myself very much as a recovering Foreign Service officer. A few years ago, actually, when I was a junior officer, I had the occasion to meet him at an event of the State Department, and he was very kind to look at junior officers and ask them questions, and he said to me, "So what do you want to do?" And I didn't really know how to answer it. I just said, "I want to be you." And I don't think that was an uncommon answer for George W. Ball, because we're all so impressed with how he conducted himself. Great sense of humor, but not a lot of trying to take the limelight. He was kind of an indispensable person. I mean, you can imagine you have a meeting on something. You can imagine the principal of the meeting kind of looks around and, "Where's George?" Because I don't think people like to make decisions without him in the room. I mean, and to take that awful expression from today, he was definitely an influencer, but he's much more than that. He was a real player in these issues, and one of the smartest, shrewdest, and I think most importantly, wisest people around. And it's no surprise that presidents and secretaries of state wanted him around. His probably greatest achievement, or he's known for this, is his opposition within the State Department to the Vietnam War. And I think in the State Department, you don't keep score by how many things went your way as opposed to things that didn't go your way, because the escalation of the Vietnam War happened in spite of George Ball's advice. But no one can say that they didn't hear the other position. No one can say they didn't hear the other position laid out in a very clear tones with the facts in front and the analysis not far behind. He understood the dangers of that conflict. And I think what I especially value from him is he understood the danger of groupthink, where before you know it, you have meetings full of people who should have different points of view, and yet they all start arguing the same thing. So I think he was willing to speak the other side of issues and to be courageous in doing. He brought practicality to policy, and he never confused talking points with reality. And I think that's an important point when you're in the State Department. You'll be in the bowels of the building writing some talking point that you expect someone to carry out. And then you look at it and you realize, wait a minute, this isn't what really matters. What really matters is getting in front of someone and getting that someone to do something that they don't want to do. I mean, getting people to say, I really don't want to do what you're doing, what you're telling me to do, but I value the relationship with you, and I especially value the relationship with the United States. And so you try to develop that trust, and that trust can lead to to a very important ingredient of leadership. And I think George W. Ball did that. I mean, plans and diplomacy, not to quote that great diplomat Mike Tyson, but often your plan ends when someone punches you in the face. And I think people need to understand that this is not a game of planning. It's a game of figuring out what is in our country's interest, what has happened, to make some decisions to move on things. And I think it would be, it's very important to be quick on your feet and able to defend your position. You know, when I think of, when I thought of kind of preparing myself for this talk, I thought to myself, would George W. Ball have had a social media account? And frankly speaking, I don't think he would have, because I don't think he was really interested in saying, in kind of drawing attention to himself. And I don't think he really saw the value of kind of just spreading it out in public terms. I think he saw the value in relationships. He saw the value in kind of getting to know people and having people respect what he had to say to them. So I think he is really what, you know, he died almost some 30 years ago, and yet he's someone I think we should live with us every day. Because, you know, diplomacy, it offers no refuge for those in need of instant gratification. When you finally do convince your interlocutor to do something, it usually takes a long time. It's a product of relationships, and yet you'll frequently find you have kind of buyer's remorse in what you've, and the person will accept it, and then the next day the person will say, well, I'm not so sure I really want to do that after all. I remember when I was in the Dayton Peace Accords, Ambassador Holbrooke, a mentor of mine and a tormentor of mine as well, asked me to go to Serbia right after Dayton to make sure that there was no change in the fact that Milosevic had accepted the Dayton Peace Accords, because I think Holbrooke understood that people will change their minds, and they need to have your reassurance that this is the right way to go. I have no doubt that this is an era where we need diplomacy more than ever. You know, people often talk about the fog of war. Well, try the fog of diplomacy. I mean, sometimes you don't know if you're in the middle, or you don't know if you're in the beginning or the end of a process. What you do know is you're in the muddle of the process, and you need to have clear values, clear understanding of where you're heading, a kind of compass in your mind about what you really want out of a particular negotiation. You know, with modern communication, often the State Department is trying to kind of keep you informed on the latest thinking there, but at some point you have to just kind of go with what your gut is telling you and how you need to proceed. Diplomacy is definitely an art. It's never been described as a science, and it's easy to understand why. There is no question today in 2021, in the past few years, it has been a very rough time for the US, and I think especially a rough time for diplomacy. Diplomacy is a game where you're really trying to work with others. By definition, that's what you're trying to do. You are not going to be able to just convince people, as President Biden likes to say, by the logic of force. You want the force of logic. And I think we need to get back to that in a big way in the coming months and years. When I look at some of the issues out there, it's quite daunting. And I think even George W. Ball would have been daunted by what we're seeing. We're seeing, to some extent, a sort of breakdown of state structures. We're seeing great power conflict and enmity. Not that any of these things have never been seen before, but it's kind of more of it, and it's just unrelenting. We're also seeing some problems internally in the U.S. that clearly need to be addressed if we're going to be able to do a better job externally. Again, these are not issues that would be foreign to George W. Ball, but the extent of them would have been quite daunting to him. To see the politicization of just about everything in our country, I think is quite frightening. to see the lack of respect for our institutions that have been around, in some cases right back to Thomas Jefferson, and to see the contempt that many people hold for these institutions. Contempt, by the way, that was, I think, reinforced by the last administration at times. These are issues that really affect us because other countries are watching very carefully. We've seen, I think, an excessive amount of money go into politics, and the money going into politics has affected our foreign policy. We know we have had political appointees as ambassadors for many years. We'll have many years more of that. But what we're seeing a lot of in past years is it's not so much people have some particular perspective on country X. We're seeing increasingly tendency to have people being given positions because of the extent of their money, of their contributions. And so we have to start paying attention to that. I mean, this could be ultimately lead to a view that I've already seen in other countries that somehow even our foreign policy is for sale, and we need to be especially careful as we go forward on that. I think the United States, there's no question that our leadership is sought after in the world. I don't believe in the concept that somehow the U.S. Will not be a leader in coming decades. And the reason I don't believe it is I don't think there's anyone who's really able to step up and take our place. There's a great deal of concern right now about the relationship with China. Is China trying to displace us in this century? That is the idea that somehow the US was in a preeminent position in the last century and we're turning that over to the Chinese. I don't think that's our problem. I think our problem is to make sure that we are the strong country that we should be. We need to understand that our institutions need to be supported. And to some extent, we need to understand that politics really should try to stop at the water's edge. Now, George W. Bush knew very well that politics does not stop at the water's edge. A lot of our foreign policy issues have a real political cast to them. But again, it's not so much the issue of whether this has ever happened before. It certainly has. It's the issue of whether we are allowing this to happen everywhere, where even foreign policy issues far away from our country's shores are being lined up in a political way. So I think our country's unity is probably the biggest task looking ahead. And then beyond that, we need to see how we can secure our leadership, not just for our good, but for the good of others. And again, I've seen this in so many countries where they want to see us back, as President Biden describes us. They want to see us back, but they also want to see us in a listening mode. I think too often we are in a sort of broadcast mode. Too often we have taken foreign policy as a kind of latter-day sort of secular missionary approach, where in fact I think the key for leadership is to listen as much as you're talking, to understand where your allies want to go with an issue, and to see if we can forge common ground. I was very pleased to see some of this already underway. I think the recent meetings, especially in Seoul and in Tokyo, suggested that the US position will be kind of different to how we pursued policies with these countries in the past, in the recent past. That is, we'll be doing a lot of listening. We had some repair to do in the bilateral relationship with Korea, and certainly some to do in Japan. For example, we really have completed the issue of host nation support for US military assets in Korea. And we completed that in a way that I think speaks to the fact that we have troops in South Korea and we have in Japan, not for just our benefit, but also for the benefit, it's for the benefit of both. And I think too often people in this country think that somehow, and certainly our previous president thought this, that somehow they're only there for the South Koreans, and therefore the South Koreans should pay sort of rent money to have these troops there. So I think we need to make sure people understand they're there for us and they're there for South Koreans. That's the concept of an alliance. And I think the same goes for Japan. So I was pleased to see an effort to kind of address these issues. Certainly Korea and Japan, certainly since my time, have been very much affected by deteriorating bilateral relations. There are a lot of reasons for that. Many of the reasons go back into history. These are not issues that the US needs to solve or necessarily get into some formal mediation role, but it's certainly an issue where the US, I think, can encourage the two countries to work through these problems, because it will be a much stronger alliance if they can do that. I think we have issues, obviously, in the NATO alliance. This is still the preeminent alliance in the world. It's an alliance that all the people who were involved in formulating it way back in the 1940s can feel very proud, because NATO has really stood the test of time. But there are new roles and missions. We saw that certainly after 9/11. It was pretty much unbelievable, frankly speaking, to see NATO in these out-of-area roles. It frankly started during the Balkans, but it's extended to places like Afghanistan. But we need to stay in close communication with our allies. To be sure, people need to do more in terms of the military structures they bring, the costs of the expenses they're willing to bear. But we also ought to understand that there's a lot more to the fabric of an alliance than simply measuring it in terms of how much the military assistance or military preparedness is. NATO is fundamentally a military alliance, but it's also something bigger. And it's become something bigger in a way that I think perhaps has surprised many of its participants, but nonetheless, I think has been as one that has made the North Atlantic a stronger alliance than ever before. To be sure, we have deep problems with contemporary Russia. This is not to be too tangentious about it, but this is a country that I think is in a certain amount of long-term decline, whereas I would argue the difference with China is in a period of long-term ascendancy. And the question is a period of decline a time when it is even more dangerous than a country that sees itself as going forward, as China clearly does. So again, these are issues that require not military might, certainly military preparedness, but certainly not a saber rattling, but rather a decent respect to listening to the other side. It's going to be very tough, but we need to be very clear that countries that share our values, and most of the NATO countries do, can take heart by the fact that we are in Europe and destined to stay. And I think we're kind of finally setting that up as a proposition that I think countries can count on us with. It has been really, I think, a very difficult process in dealing with China. But there again, we need to be careful of how we deal with China, how we manage some of these issues around China. I very much support the idea of bringing India into the dialogue, that is, having this kind of Quad-based diplomacy where we include India, which in the past was not a country that really took great interest in East Asia, despite the fact that East Asia, I think, is very important to India. But we don't want to be conveying the idea to the Chinese that we're seeking some type of containment or some type of, worse yet, encircling of China. I think one of the best things we ever did was done in the early 70s when we reached out to China, and we essentially broke the China-Soviet axis. In so doing, I think if you're going to date the end of the Cold War, you probably have to go back to Shanghai in 1972. It was very successful for us because we understood the Chinese concerns about this gradual encirclement that they felt they were undergoing. So we need to be clear that is not our goal. But we also need to be clear to our values. I see nothing wrong with with speaking clearly about Hong Kong. I see nothing wrong with speaking clearly about Xinjiang and the fact that the treatment of the Uyghurs is not something that anyone's going to accept. But I think we need to focus on making sure that we are creating an atmosphere, an envelope, if you will, for China's growth to follow. China is going to grow, and they're going to be a bigger and even more important country in the future. And our task is not to somehow hold China down, but make sure that growth can be in the context of what's been said 1,000 times before, making sure that China sees its role as that of a responsible stakeholder in a world that is very much, whose formation is very much in China's interest. To be sure, this is not going to be easy. The Chinese unilateralism, whether it's in trying to turn the South China Sea into a southern Chinese lake, is not sustainable for the Chinese, and it's not sustainable for us. But we need to be in East Asia, not just as a military power, but also as a country that understands we have good friends and allies there, whether Japan and Korea in the north or some of the ASEAN countries in the south. We are very committed to a long-term relationship in Asia. And actually, to quote Xi Jinping some years ago, there is room in Asia for both of us. And I think we need to try harder to deal with these increasing difficulties we have with the Chinese. You know, when you step back and look at where we are in the world, you know, this pandemic was a horrific event, and yet I think we kind of came through that. You can see vaccines going to all kinds of different countries in the world. I frankly would like to make sure that we're in the vanguard of what is called in China vaccination diplomacy. I'd like to see us helping some of the countries in the global south deal with this pandemic. The global south is really upon us, and I think we need to do more to enhance relations with some of these key countries. You know, I think to some extent in foreign policy, and I'm sure George W. Ball would agree with this proposition, the urgent often crowds out the important, and often the urgent are on issues such as China or issues such as Russia. But I think we need to understand that the important is that we have billions of people coming up in many of these countries, and we want these countries in a position to care for their people, and also we want to be able to develop good relations with these countries. It's quite a tall order today, and not the least of it is where I started with it, which is the difficulties internally within the US. The fact that people, I think, too often look at foreign policy not so much on its own terms, but rather on the terms of whether you're tough or not tough. And so I think there's a lot more to foreign policy that needs to be looked at. And finally, let me close with the not very famous words of a party first secretary in Eastern Europe many decades before. Władysław Gomułka is probably a name lost to history. He was a Polish party first secretary in the 1950s, and he was known for very long speeches and not very successful metaphors. And one day he stood up in front of a crowd in the southern Polish city of Krakow, and he said to this crowd, he said, "Just a few years ago, comrades, our fatherland stood on the very edge of a deep abyss. And today I'm here to tell you, comrades, that we have taken an important step forward." I think we need to be careful about not taking that step forward. I think we need to be careful about looking at where we've come, respecting the opinions of others, trying to pull ourselves together in a way that we've not been able to do for some time, and make sure that our leadership, our leadership, which I think has been so extraordinarily valuable to this world in the last century and going forward in this century, that our leadership stems from our example. And so I think if we can do that, and I have every reason we can do that, and if we can rebuild our institutions and rebuild trust in those institutions, including in my alma mater, if you will, the State Department, I think we will succeed. I see nothing systemic out there that prevents us from having this better future. It's just that I think we need to get serious about it. We need to kind of calm down with each other, take sort of rampant competition more into the sports arena and a little less into some of this political arena, and see if we can do a better job. So thank you very much, and I look forward to having much more of an interactive process for this group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hill. Very provocative and interesting. I'd like to just invite our many attendees. We have wonderful participation from all over the world to please feel free to add additional questions. We have a great group of questions starting, but we'll turn to those in a few minutes. Let me now invite Professor Sestanovich to offer a comment and question.
Thank you very much, Merritt. It's a pleasure to join Chris Hill in this event. He's a former colleague, and some of our audience may not know how rare it is for American diplomats to be ambassador 4 times, but that was Chris's achievement. I also want to plug, as you did, the book on his shelf, but behind him, Outpost, very good read. Chris, I want to ask you a 2-part question, reflecting the 2 phrases that I think have been most prominent in the Biden administration's presentation of the foreign policy. One is, you use this, saying America is back. And the other is that there's no division between foreign policy and domestic politics. I get the impression, here's the first part of it, that for many foreign governments, the second is thought to be a big constraint on the first. That is that the domestic preoccupations of the United States will really keep it from the leadership role that it used to have. Do you think that is actually a view that is widely shared and that has to be overcome? And the second part of it is just to get your views as to how the administration is doing it being back. Maybe you can give us your thoughts about how the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor handled their meetings with Chinese officials last week in Alaska.
Well, I mean, with respect to the issue of the sort of seamlessness of domestic policy and foreign policy, I understand why you would make that a slogan. I think it's important for American people to understand the importance of these issues. So I understand that as an effort to say to the American people, hey, you got to pay attention to these things. They matter to you in your daily lives. Because I think for too many Americans, foreign policy was, as I said, more of a sort of substitute for, are you a tough guy or not? And that's really not enough on foreign policy. So I like to think that it's an effort to recruit the American people into the belief that they ought to really spend some time understanding these issues. It obviously has to be followed up with some real effort, because it's clear right now, everyone in this country has an opinion about everything. I mean, it used to just be New York taxi drivers, but now it's everybody. And so having opinions is great, having uninformed opinion not so great. And I like to think the administration is simply trying to make a message to the American people in that regard. I was overseas much of my career. I was dealing with issues where, Washington, they'd want to have, outfit you with a helmet cam and tell you exactly where to go, what to say, who to bring to your meetings, et cetera. So I find myself not wanting to second guess people who are out in places like Alaska. So with that caveat in mind, I think it's very important to tell the press what you're doing and why you're doing it. I remember when I was dealing with North Korea, I found it kind of amazing that really 99% of what I was dealing with, I could easily tell anybody. It wasn't classified material or anything. So I think, having the press understand what you're doing is important. I guess from the presentational point of view, when you ask them to come in for an opening statement, the question I would ask is, well, why are we doing that? And is it to show people, hey, we got a boatload of problems dealing with this country, and I show to you as Exhibit A the problems of our positions going into the topic. I guess I understand that, but if that was the intention. If it was not the intention, I don't understand it, because I think it's important that when you do something, you do it with intention. And the press, you got to be very careful. And because they will, they love sort of let's you and him fight. And so you got to be careful on that. If that's what they wanted to do, okay. I don't want to judge it yet, but I do want to say that we need to show that given all the issues out there in the world, that we can kind of establish some patterns of communication with the Chinese and work on some things that we have in common. I know people always talk about the issue of whether we can do more with the Chinese on climate change, and I understand that because that also includes the 300 or so million Americans who care about that. My sort of hardy perennial that I always point to is North Korea. And I'd like to see us kind of sit down with the Chinese and see what can be done with that. Because I worked with them for 4 years. I met with them for about 50 times. And I never got the sense from the Chinese that they wanted North Korea to have nuclear weapons. So I would like to see us start very soon to start having some patterns of cooperation, which I don't think needs to look weak, because Lord knows we have a lot of economic issues that need to be addressed. But I think people need some hope that we're going to be able to turn this ship around.
Well, thank you very much. We've gotten quite a few questions, including around Iraq, Afghanistan, North Korea. Let me try and share a few of those with you. First, with respect to Iraq and Afghanistan, the question is asked, what do you think what is the US role with respect to these forever wars? The question asked, do you think it's wise for us to remain engaged, or now is the time for diplomatic and military drawdowns? And do you look to the timetable established by the Trump administration, or do you think about it differently? So let me start there.
I think, and I'm going to express my own personal views on this, I think there was, the great irony is in the 1990s when I was dealing with the Balkans, there was a lot of criticism, especially coming from the Republican side, about so-called mission creep, that in addition to keeping the peace and keeping the inter-entity boundary line in Bosnia, we would soon be, mixing it up with Bosnian Serb militias and Bosniak militias and Croatian militias, and there was all this worry about mission creep. The irony of all that, of course, is we've seen extraordinary amounts of mission creep in Iraq and Afghanistan. When I was in Iraq, it was not until 2009. I think there was a sense among many people who had been there from the beginning that somehow they turned the corner, they had turned it into a winning proposition, and we just needed to stay the course. And then you would have to endure such comments such as, well, we were in Germany for 40 years, surely we can be in Iraq for more time. In fact, I think ultimately our ability to manage Iraqi politics is rather is kind of out there. I don't think it's going to work, and I think where we need to be very active is in the counterterrorism piece. I like to see that we have assets there that can help the Iraqis deal with whatever the remnants of ISIS are, or these other sort of extreme Sunni groups. There was a lot of this talk early on that somehow we had won the day because of the surge And I think in the sort of solipsism of American politics, that it's always about us and not about anybody else, I think we missed the fact that the people who had changed their minds about going after Al-Qaeda and company were the Iraqis, not just us. So I think we ought to keep it simple and keep it targeted. And so I support whatever size mission we need to deal with the terrorist threat in Iraq. I think we need to be very careful, as our previous president was not, in talking about we need to be in Iraq to, quote, keep an eye on the Iranians. We do need to keep an eye on the Iranians, but to somehow suggest that that's why we're in Iraq is not doesn't portend to having a good future with Iraq. So I think we need to be careful about that type of mission creep, but I think we ought to leave governance to the Iraqis. Again, in Afghanistan is a very tough situation. To talk about what we're trying to do with the Taliban is very, very difficult. And of course, the risk of it is that somehow at the end of the day, it'll look a little like helicopters leaving the roof of the embassy in Vietnam. But we are where we are, and I think I would support the idea of keeping that smaller and simpler and going after people who really, really are not prepared to play by any kind of rules. So these are tough issues, but I just don't think we can go at them ad infinitum in the way we have.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me turn now to North Korea, and we have a couple of questions, including from Korean students who observe that one has made the point that he doesn't believe that either China or the United States can denuclearize North Korea on their own, and that perhaps a better way is, in fact, through multinational cooperation, such as using mechanisms like the six-party talks. And how do you see the potential for the United States and China working on this problem, given what U.S. policy is with China at the moment?
Yeah, I think, I mean, my own personal view, I can't speak to the question right now of how the administration's review of all this is going. My own personal view is the more the merrier. If you have 6 parties, I don't have a strong view whether it ought to be 4 or 8, but I think we should not be trying to suggest that this problem is all about us. And I think it's important to have China at the table. Again, I think if you think it's hard to work with China, try working against China. So I think having them at the table is valuable. So I would support the reconstitution of some kind of multi-party setup there. It's not easy, but I think it also prevents the North Koreans from feeling they can go initiative shopping. If they don't like what you have to say about it, they go to the Chinese. If they don't like what the Chinese say, they go to the Russians. But if everyone's around the same table and informed by the same 6-party plan or process, I think it kind of minimizes that problem. Not that that problem goes away, but it is an issue. To those who say, oh, this is a fool's errand, it can never be done. Well, never is a long time. And I think the danger of allowing North Korea to maintain nuclear weapons is considerable. And I think we need to convince them that they have a better future without them than they do with them. How you convince them of that, I think you need diplomatic isolation. I think you need to keep the door open to negotiation. I don't think we should say, we'll never talk to you unless you say the right thing. So I think we need to have mechanisms for keeping the door open. But I think we need really unrelenting pressure on them. It doesn't have to be something described in the newspapers every day. I don't mean to talk about some of the things that were done in the Iranian program, but I think we should be looking at a lot of different options on the table. There's a lot of difference between war and peace. There's a lot of gray area there. And I just think we need to make the North Koreans understand that we have a lot of options here. Don't have the option of walking away, so don't think we're going to lose interest in this, but a lot of options. And one of those options is not strategic patience, because I think people have seen through that. And that was a sort of unwillingness to take on the issue. And I know there are a lot of critics of talking to the North Koreans, in dealing with it. I mean, I felt I had more problems behind me in Washington. And I know there are a lot of critics, but I think you just have to take on the critics. And I remember asking some guy from a three-word network, well, what would you do? And there was this dead silence. And I said, well, take your time. And he had absolutely no idea. So a lot of this criticism, you just need to kind of put people on the spot. You realize they don't have a better idea.
Well, thank you. I'd like to ask one more series of questions about China, if I may. And, I just observed that, the Secretary of State made the point, that it was important for the United States to compete with China where we must and cooperate where we can. And yet, as you have observed, early interaction has been very difficult. And a question coming in from one of our attendees here is quoting Tom Friedman's piece today when Director Young told his U.S. counterparts allegedly that the U.S. does not have the qualification to speak to China from a position of strength. And so, if you put these elements together, what kind of diplomatic actions, could do the most to change that view? Or is that really going back to Steve Sestanovich's point that, you get your own house in order first, and at that point, you're in a position to be able to address through diplomacy?
Yeah, look, I'm all in favor of getting our house in order. I don't think you could have a sort of von Schlieffen plan. At first we get our house in order and then we take on these issues. Obviously, we're going to be doing a lot of things simultaneously, but we do need to get our house in order. We do need to regain some notion of bipartisanship on some of these issues, or at least a willingness, not to carry politics everywhere we go. So I think that has to be done. I think that would strengthen our position. But as for the Chinese saying in the first meeting with the U.S. that somehow, worrying about Black Lives Matter or other domestic issues, I mean, I appreciate the Chinese concern about our domestic issues. And I appreciate what they're trying to do, which is to be drippingly ironic that somehow we won't discuss our domestic issues, but we expect them to discuss their domestic issues. But, I'm old enough to remember dealing with Soviet diplomats who just would never stop talking about our domestic issues, whether it was their view of, I don't know, some police force in Texas or something. I think we need to be clear about why we're going to raise issues, whether you want Hong Kong to be your number one issue or somewhere else. I think we're going to be clear that these are issues related to what we are as a people. We're going to raise them. I wouldn't be embarrassed about it or shy away from it or be intimidated by it. But I think the Chinese need to understand that we need to sort of look at these things, soup to nuts, and see if we can find a way forward in terms of the relationship. I still believe that there's a lot that unites us. It's quite obscured right now, and certainly when we haven't even talked about technology and trade, those questions, but I still believe that we have a lot of common issues with China, and I hope that at some point we can get to enough of those that people will understand that this is a valuable relationship, because right now, with some notable exceptions, Tom Christensen wrote a really excellent piece in Foreign Affairs, which I just saw this morning. We need to understand that ultimately we need to work with China. China's not going away, and neither are we.
Mhm. Thank you very much. So one of the questions asks, you want to bring India to the table, but how can we be confident that India will not become another China in some ways, considering its current democratic crisis? Is
Yeah,
that how you see things?
I think India has a lot of internal problems, always have, but certainly one worries about what you see going on in India with their own governance questions. Uh, all that said, we're talking about over 1 billion people. I think it's appropriate that India be far further up on the pecking order of our foreign policy issues than it was before. I guess what I worry a little about is the whole Indo-Pacific approach. I mean, I think that term is here to stay. Although when I went to school and I looked at a map, I always saw the Pacific and the Indian Ocean as different bodies of water. But I guess what I don't want to see is some crude effort to somehow think that we can weaponize a relationship with India or leverage the relationship with our problems with China. I think we're going to have to deal with China, on its own terms. So, but if what we see with this India relationship is an understanding that we need to have a close working relationship with a country comprised of over 1 billion people, I'm all in favor of that. If it's seen as some sort of network against China, I think we ought to be a little careful. And I'm frankly speaking, for some of the reasons you alluded to, I'm not sure the Indians want to see that either.
Thank you very much. So we have a question that's asking about climate change and how our focus on climate change and the geopolitics of climate change is going to be reflected in our diplomacy.
Every administration starts off by, or every State Department starts off by talking about the preeminence of functional bureaus over these old geographic bureaus. And wow, we're really going to take this on this time. And it usually takes a couple of months, and you get back to the fact that geographic bureaus are, where you actually deal with foreign countries. I think there will be a change in this administration. First of all, I think the issue of climate is so much upon us in a way that I don't think it was quite upon us in the past. That's one reason. And I think bureaucratically, the appointment of a former Secretary of State, a guy who ran for president, came pretty close to manage these climate issues, I think is a very important step. So for the substance of it and the bureaucratics of it, I think it's much further up in the pecking order of this nascent administration than in the past. So I don't discount it at all. I think it's correct to understand that this is not just something that can be handled within our country. I mean, you could do the best job on climate that you can, and then you have air problems coming over oceans, and before you know it, you're back in the soup, so to speak. So I'm kind of optimistic that the administration is not only on a declaratory basis saying it's important, but also is putting some effort behind it. And I guess in the era of trillion-dollar deficits where no one seems to care anymore, I guess you could do a lot in that regard and put some real budget behind it. But I just feel that the urgency of the question is resulting, and by the way, I think it's an area where we can work with the Chinese on this. I'm kind of optimistic that we're going to see it in a better place.
Well, thank you very much. I think in our last 5 minutes, I'd like to raise a couple of questions asked by students who are clearly anticipating careers in the Foreign Service. And they're asking, how do they prepare themselves, in your view, for such careers? And what did you find the most frustrating that they should be mindful of as they embark down this road?
Well, First of all, I mean, forgive the cliche, the aphorism, but it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so the problem today is you have a lot of political appointees coming in, and political appointee might come in, and the entry level of a political appointee might be deputy assistant secretary. Well, deputy assistant secretary for foreign service officers is a culmination of a career. So you go in as a career, and then you see someone come in and immediately become a deputy assistant secretary and become your boss's boss's boss. It's a little hard to take. I would argue that there is no better calling to serve our country, in the capacity of a foreign service officer or civil service, military as well. When I say thank you to your service, it's for a lot of different kinds of service. And weirdly, at the end of an administration, all the political appointees go back to being, working in think tanks or whatever, and you're still there from the Foreign Service, and you're still dealing with the problems. It's kind of a good feeling, and I think you do have a sense that you have an important responsibility to keep the trains moving. Foreign Service officers are not political. They may have personal views, but they want to serve. I mean, one of the great tragedies of the Trump administration was to see Rex Tillerson arrive at the C Street entrance, be mobbed by hundreds of employees at the State Department welcoming his arrival, and thinking that they had in this secretary somebody who was really going to lead that building. And then he went up to his office and shut the door. No one saw him for a few weeks. So Foreign Service officers appreciate the leadership. They appreciate the people coming in from various walks of life, and it's not true that Foreign Service officers resent political appointees. They welcome this. And so if you're looking at the Foreign Service or looking at one of these civil service positions, I don't think there's a better walk of life. It is when I was in the Peace Corps, there I was in Buea, Cameroon. They gave you a Suzuki 125 dirt bike, and I remember going to this credit union in the middle of nowhere, and I was auditing credit unions, and they asked me about stuff, and I realized, oh my God, I'm representing the greatest country on earth. And so, for people thinking about it, just remember it's an opportunity to represent as a career the greatest country on earth. And so I hope they do it, or at least give it a try.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank you for your very important and engaging remarks. A lot for us to think about. I also want to thank you for being with us this semester, going to the real trouble of being with us in New York, teaching in the classroom, being very available to our students. This is, greatly appreciated, and for giving us insights from a very distinguished career. Steve Sestanovich, thank you for joining us today and for your great question and ongoing contributions to the intellectual life of SIPA. And for the many attendees, thank you all for joining us from all over the world today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Merritt. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Merritt.